Monster Mondays, episode 23, Ted the Caver. Estimated reading time, 86 minutes. Might want to get something to drink. I myself am having this. Hashtag not sponsored. I just like it. Although, I'd love it if they did a sponsorship, but honestly, I don't blame them. I only got, 15 subscribers right now? Okay. Oh, whatever. It'll probably be more by the time anyone realizes this video is here. We'll see. Let's see. There it is. The church key, as we call it. Here we go. Due to the overwhelming number of requests I've received to tell about my discoveries and bizarre experiences in a cave not far from my home, I've created this webpage. I will outline the events that happened to me during the past few months. Beginning with my journey into a familiar cave in December 2000, ending well. It actually hasn't ended yet, but we'll use my caving journal as the text to tell about my recent experience. I'll give them to you as I experienced them in chronological order. I've included photographs that were taken during my many trips into the cave. I've also created a few illustrations that'll help the reader better understand what things looked like in the cave. All the photos were taken by me, or one of the few people I went into the cave with. I want to point out a few things before I talk about the events. One, most of the pictures, if you read the Wikia that is, were taken with a Kodak disposable type camera. I took a better camera into the cave on one or two of the trips. Photos on this site are all original and have not been messed with or enhanced, other than where noted. As a rule, I get my pictures put onto a disc when developing so I don't have to scan them later. This ensures the best digital quality. 2, I will not reveal the names of the other people involved in this experience. If you know me well enough, you probably know them already. 3, I will not reveal the location of the cave to anyone for any reason, so please don't ask. I refuse to be held accountable for anyone's life but my own. I'll refer to the cave as Mystery Cave. That is not its real name. If you think these events sound far-fetched, I agree. I would have come to the same conclusion had I not experienced them. I'll try to finish the site as soon as possible. Check the date on the main page to see when I've made updates. To protect my content from people who might try to copy this site, I include the following. All text on this in the following page are my own words in copyright 2001, Ted. I will divide the text into 2 colors for the sake of clarity. The plain text is taken directly from my caving journal. The italicized text is my comment as I reflect on the experience. I'll do my best to convey the thoughts and feelings I had during the entire event. I'll not use the actual names of the other individuals involved. I will include the whole relevant text in my journal. Only small parts of the journal will I skip. This will only occur when the entry has nothing to do with the experience of the cave, such as eating dinner after a trip, getting fuel or snacks, or irrelevant details, etc. My journal is pretty thorough. I will merely summarize what I'm cutting out of the actual entry. To present this experience as accurately as possible, I will type my journal as I wrote it, sans grammar check. Please overlook my errors. My additional comments will help to clarify things I wrote in my journal. For the record, I did go over them grammarly, and man, that probably took the longest time for me. There were like, I want to say 800, 900, errors. I mean, most of them weren't necessarily grammar. Some of them were style inconsistencies, just little things that if you're tired, you'll miss it, but, if you're awake, you'll be like, how the heck did I miss that? Anyway, the point is, this is the best version it could possibly be because I spent countless hours working on re-grammar checking this. Although, in actuality, my actual clocked in hours was probably 8 hours on this particular project, but still. For what it's worth, I think this is probably as good as it's gonna get. If you can do better, be my guest. Caving Journal, December 30th, 2000. Dee and I decided to get one more caving trip before the new year, so we set our sights on Mystery Cave. Not a spectacular cave, but we'd not been caving in a while. There was a bit of excitement to this trip. There was a small passage in the lower portion of the cave that I wanted to check out to see if it was possible to get past it. It had a small opening, but lots of air blowing out of it. Even though it's way too small to climb through, I'd never even checked to see what was inside the passage. We got our gear loaded up and hit the road by 3 o'clock p.m. We got to the cave in great time since B likes to drive fast. We anchored from the usual tree and began to rappel into the cave. I went down first and got my gear together while B came down. I referred to B many times. We've been caving together for many months now. He was injured in a caving accident a few years ago and was told he would never walk again. Through hard work and perseverance, he not only walks, but he can get around very well in caves. The trickier parts of the cave might slow him down a bit, but he can make it. He patiently works through an obstacle until he gets past it. As for the reference to the small opening in the cave, there's a saying among cavers: if it blows, it goes. Meaning if the passage has a good flow of air, it's probably worth investigating. After we explored all the familiar passages, we climbed down to check out the hole. The hole is located deep in the cave, near the lowest parts of the cave. It is on the side of the cave wall, about 3 feet from the floor. To look inside the hole, I had to kneel down and duck under an overhang of rock. The original opening, I put my glove in the hole for size reference. I used my backup mini mag light and held it inside the hole to see what I could see. I was excited by what I saw. The wall around the hole was about 3 to 5 inches thick. It led into a tight passage. The passage opened up just a bit inside the hole. It continued about 10 to 12 feet in a small crawl space. After that, it seemed to really open up. Although how much we couldn't tell. This could be a virgin passage. Obviously no one's passed through this route, but there could be a way into the path from the other side. To even get into the crawl space, we would have to enlarge the opening. Currently it is about the size of my fist. I'm not sure if his fist is bigger than mine or not, but, you know, if that gets any emphasis, I'll sometimes make gestures to prove the point. And enhance the story. For those who can't see it, just imagine the biggest fist you can figure. Maybe about the size of a softball. Once we get past the opening, we'd have a tight crawl back to where it opened. It would take some work, but we thought we could do it. We sat down for a few minutes to rest and contemplate our plan of attack. While we sat there in the darkness, we could hear the wind howling from the other side of the passage. It was a low, eerie noise. We could also hear a low rumble from time to time. No big deal, though. The cave was in the vicinity of a highway that has heavy trucks drive on it. We figured the rumble was the effect of the trucks resonating through the rocks. We determined our best plan would be to haul a cordless drill into the cave and drill into the rock. Then we could take a bullpen and a small sledgehammer and break up the rock. It seemed pretty straightforward. We would widen the hole big enough to squeeze in and see what was on the other side. The efforts to haul the equipment down to the gap would be a pain, but we hoped it would be worth it. I named the passage Floyd's Tomb after Floyd Collins. It seemed to look like a tight spot where Floyd spent his last miserable days on Earth. A rough drawing of how the passage initially looked. See the picture in the wiki if you really want to see it. Or just use your imagination, I don't care. Floyd Collins was a caver back in the 1900s. He got stuck in a tight crawl space and was unable to free himself. There's a fantastic story detailed in a book called Trapped, the story of Floyd Collins. I think that was the title. I don't recall the author. Calling our passage Floyd's Tomb was a tribute to Floyd and a commentary on the size of the path. Ha ha. In retrospect, it's funny how simple I thought it was going to be. I figured a few hours work and we'd be in. Had I known how long it would take, I doubt I would have even begun the project. Had I known what I was going to experience in the cave, I never would have returned. We gathered up our gear and headed for the surface. I usually couldn't care less if we ever came back into the cave. There's nothing special about it, but now I was psyched about getting back and getting through. We hadn't even left the cave and we were planning our return trip. The rest of the journal entry described the climb out of the cave, our dinner, and a trip back home. January 27th through the 28th, 2001. B and I were both excited to go back into the cave and get to work. I figured with about 4 hours of work we could be in and see what was on the other side. We'd arranged to borrow a DeWalt cordless drill to bring with us. We also had masonry bits to drill with, sledgehammers, 2 of them, to break up the rock, and bullpens to insert into the drill holes, as well as a few tools that we ended up not using. Getting the devices down to the worksite proved to be a challenge. One of us would climb down the rope and stop at a ledge or get a good resting place, and the other person would lower the tools. We kept repeating this routine until we got to the bottom of the cave. Then we had to drag the means to the hole. It took about an hour to finally get to work. B took the first turn at the hole. After an hour of exhausting work, we could tell we would not get through in one session. We kept trading off after we worked ourselves into a sweat. One would take a break and get some food and water while the other went to work. The routine went like this. To begin work, we had to get down on our knees and do our best to avoid smacking our heads on the ceiling. I know that problem too well. I'm very tall. Well, okay, I'm only 5'11", but still, I've been to, the freaking Hollywood Bowl, and they got this lower ceiling that if I don't, duck like this in it, I'm probably going to hit my head on it. I'm sure some of you guys who've ever been to the Hollywood Bowl know what I'm talking about on the exit route. Working in this awkward position, we would drill into the wall around the hole. That was difficult work. We really had to push on the drill, and it was still slow to progress. Then we inserted the bullpen into the hole and hammered it until the rock broke up. Then we would repeat the process. To give you an idea how slow it went, the typical size of rock that would break off was about fingernail size, so maybe this or that. If you can even see it from there, I'm pretty far away from the camera right now. Or just look at your own fingernails, I don't care. It's probably about as accurate as what they're saying here. If we broke off a large piece, about a third of the palm size, it was a cause for celebration. From time to time, for variety, we would just wail on a cold chisel with a 5-pound sled. It was slow progress. The problem with the sled was we couldn't take a good swing because of the tight quarters. Even though we'd spent many hours and several trips working on the hole, we never did find a better technique for widening the gap. The drill, bullpen, and hammer got the best results for our efforts. We came up with some crazy ideas for breaking up the rock, everything from TNT, never seriously considered. I would hope not. That's just gonna trap you inside. I'm not even a caver, and I know that. To hauling a generator to the mouth of the cave and running an extension cord down to the jackhammer. Jackhammer. We even thought about using a liquid nitrogen to freeze the rock and make it more brittle. After a couple hours of hard work, we realized what our limiting factor was going to be. It was about then our first battery met an abrupt death. We had a second battery, so we swapped them out. The second battery lasted a little longer because we hammered and chiseled a little more often and a little longer each time. Finally, after about 3 more hours of drudgery, the second battery died and we called it a night. Whew! We could tell we'd done some work in the cave, but it was not much. For the first time since we got in the cave, we sat back, both of us took a break. It's nice to check out the results of our hard work. Then we noticed the howling again. It seemed to be a little louder than the last time when we were there. We just figured the wind was blowing a little stronger inside. What we could not figure out was the rumbling. It too seemed to be louder and more frequent. This time we could not attribute it to the trucks. The road that the trucks drove on was not very busy to begin with. At that time of night it should be dead, yet the rumbling continued. It seemed to be coming from deep within the passage. B said he would ask some veteran cavers what would be causing the noise. We didn't spend a long time admiring our work. We still had to haul the gear up and out of the cave. Actually, we left some of it in the cave. It was still tricky work. What made it worse was we were both exhausted. Our original plan was to be done with this cave and hit a couple other caves in the area the next day. Instead, we decided to crash at a nearby motel, charge up the drill batteries, and go back to Mystery Cave. A photo of the opening of our first trip. See the wikia for this one. Or imagine it, I don't care. My journal page goes on at length about the night after we left the cave. We got a room, dinner was excellent, I didn't sleep well despite being exhausted, etc. We both slept in, so we got a late start back into the cave. Second day working on the cave went about the same as the first. We worked until both batteries were dead again. We were still not even close to getting through. The howling and rumbling continued as the day before. On caving. Before I continue with the following journal entry, I thought it might be helpful to the reader to explain a bit about caving and the atmosphere in the cave. As I reread and consider the description of the cave, I note much of the language I use in my caving journal, the depictions or lack thereof, assume that the reader has knowledge of caving and what it is like inside a cave. In other words, I write my journals for me. I take this time to give more detailed description of the cave. I will tell you about what it was like while we worked on the cave, and I will summarize our feelings up to this point. The cave was discovered several decades ago when construction in the area unearthed its entrance. From that time to present, it was visited primarily by locals and avid cavers in the region. Beer cans can be found intermittently in the cave, mainly in the upper half. When the cave was first entered, it was probably beautiful. Dust, graffiti, vandals, pigeons, and regular use have diminished its appeal. There are still places in the cave where small formations remain undisturbed as a reminder of what the rest of the cave looks like. One must have a reasonable length of rope to rappel down the rock to enter the cave. A nearby tree serves as a good anchor point. Once the rope is tied to a tree about 20 feet away from a small cliff, it can be tossed over the cliff's edge to a small ledge about 15 feet below. Cavers can then descend a short distance to the entrance. Once inside the cave, artificial light must be used. My light source of choice is a battery-operated helmet-mounted light known as a tag light. Safe caving calls for at least 2 sources of backup lighting. For my backup lighting, we have a mini-mag light mounted to my helmet, another helmet-mounted light in my pack, which I always carry with me. I also have glow sticks that I carry with me. These are not considered good backup light sources, but they are good to use to take lunch breaks. And they could be used to get out of the cave if other sources fail. After a short climb over large rocks, the caver comes to a large pit. The same rope is used to reach the bottom of the hole. The drop is only 50 feet or so, but it's not free hanging. In other words, you can't slide straight down the rope, which is preferable. You have to snake your way around the sharp rocks as you descend. The ascent is made more difficult for the same reason. The pit varies in diameter from about 10 feet to 3 or 4 in a few places. The walls are lined with sharp white rock called popcorn. Sounds tasty. Let me correct that. It used to be white, but is now covered with dust and dirt kicked down from above by years of caving. The popcorn makes it less painful to brush against the side of the pit. My choice of clothing is Levi's, t-shirt, glove, and knee pads. I usually leave the cave with a few scrapes, but I'm comfortable when I climb around inside. The temperature is stable year-round, and it feels cool in the summer and warm in the winter. We've gone in on freezing days, and 10 feet into the cave it's warm enough that coats are not needed. It's an ideal temperature to work in, as we learned. From this size drop, I usually use a figure 8 descending device. I attach myself to the rope using a Petzl ascender to climb up, but I climb up independently without using the device. It is there merely as a safety attachment in case I slip. Other cavers have their own methods of getting down and up. At the bottom of the drop, the caver gets to do some crawling for a while. There's a small room about 6 by 6 feet at the bottom that gives the caver a spot to leave his harness and ascending gear. Since there are no more steep drops, the saddle is not needed and will only get in the way. Once the caver gets down to the 6 by 6 room, he can bike under a ledge while the rest of the party comes down. Then he must drop to his knees and negotiate a 10-foot long passage that is only a few feet high. That is where knee pads come in handy. The floor is covered with soft dirt intermingled with bits of broken rock from above. The thin layer of soil does nothing to soften the blow to the hands and the knees as the caver works down the crawl space. As a reward, he gets to drop to his belly at the end crawl and scoot under the tight squeeze. Not really cramped, just something low enough to make the caver sit along in the dirt. Once the caver gets on the other side of the squeeze, there are a few feet of crawl space. Then the cave opens up enough to stand. For most of the rest of the cave, the caver can stand or at least stoop. The cave splits off to several passages at this point. 2 routes wander around the rocks and crevices and come to abrupt dead ends. The other 2 lead to small pools of water. Each course is fun to explore. They all lead on 100 feet or so in a gradual downward slope. Most of the time the caver can walk upright in the passages. Other times he'll have to climb over large boulders or occasionally crawl on hands and knees. Water is a common occurrence in caves. One of the local residents was one of the first people in the cave, and that his cousin dove into the pools using scuba gear. He said the cave continued down for a couple 100 feet underwater. They were hoping for what happens frequently, that the passage comes up somewhere else with virgin cave passages to explore. Unfortunately, I don't possess the knowledge to give more detail about the types of rocks in the cave. When we were drilling, we would have some parts that were easier to penetrate than others. And there were different colors in the rock. Refer to the photos taken in the cave in the Wikia. But that is the best I can do to describe the makeup of the cave. At this point, the cave splits into 4 routes. 2 passages that dead end us to the immediate left of the caver. Straight ahead to the right are passages that lead to pools of water. The entrance to the path on the right is the largest of the 4. The arched opening rises nearly 10 feet in the air, ending a mere foot below the cave ceiling. As the caver enters the passage, the top gradually lowers until it is about 6 feet high. It continues at the same height for 40 feet, and the path travels in a continuous direction. The section of cave resembles a hard rock mine. Its arch is nearly perfect, and the floor is flat and easy to walk on. It's easy to picture rusty mine cars on rail lines, and dust-covered miners with blistered hands gripping dull picks. The pseudo-mine comes to an end. Once again, the caver is forced to drop onto hands and knees and reacquainted with the cave floor. This time the crawl lasts about 20 feet. The base is sloping gently downward for the first half of the crawl, and it gets pretty steep and slippery. Able-bodied cavers can still climb down carefully the slippery slope. When I go with B, I carry the end of the rope used to get down to this point. I usually need to tie another short string to the first rope to make sure he can use it to reach the bottom. The crawl lasts a few feet beyond the bottom of the slide. Over the next 10 to 12 feet, the caver slowly begins to regain the standing position. After walking a few feet, climbing down a short drop-off, the caver arrives at a trim level area that has a passage leading down immediately to the left. The path ends 75 feet later at one of the small bodies of water. To the right is a rock wall. Straight ahead is an indentation in the wall which goes back about 3 feet. On the wall in the rear of the indent is a small hole about the size of a softball. The caver ducks under an overhang to get near the spot and kneels on the rocks. The rocks rise above the floor by a few inches. By the time the caver reaches this point, he's either warm or sweating, and the first thing he notices is the cool breeze blowing out of the hole. A recognition of the hole as a potential doorway to unexplored portions of the cave ultimately led to the story. As has always been my tradition, the party reaches a point, usually the deepest part of the cave. All lights are extinguished. Complete blackness fills the eyes. For a moment, the individual caver strains the eye muscles, focusing in and out with the expectation of catching a crumb of light. Somewhere in the false night, after several futile moments, the caver turns his head at the sound, perhaps another caver, only to have found his senses return and then heighten. Sounds, smells, and feelings that have been overlooked to this point come racing to the caver in perfect detail. The pain of their own behind sitting on the cave floor, the smell of dust, sweat, guano, the sound of modern material shifting on an ancient rock as cavers attempt to find comfort in a solid foundation. In the back of every caver's mind at this time is, what if? What if a person had to climb out of the cave with no light? Would he make it? Would he find all the turns and bends which got him to this place? If not, would a rescue party find him in time? The depth of darkness recognized at this time is something that is rarely experienced outside of a cave. Many first-time cavers erroneously declare they'd have to hold their hand within 2 to 3 inches of their face before they can see it. The truth is the human eye is incapable of seeing in the absence of light. If they did not hear something coming towards them, they would feel it before they saw it. Complete and total dark. This exercise is a great way to remind people to take backup lighting. As we proceeded to work in the cave, we developed a system pretty early, and little changed in succeeding trips. The first time in the cave, B took the first shift at chipping away at the opening. After about half an hour, he needed a break, so I took over. He told me what worked best, and I continued doing the same. We'd try new things from time to time and use new muscles. We'd usually stick to the same method. We would use a bit of masonry and press on the drill as hard as possible and drill out a hole in the rock. Safety glasses and dust masks were worn while working. Then we would insert the bullpen and hammer into the rock to break out small chunks of the cave. We'd then drill another hole and repeat the process. Occasionally the drill would hit a soft spot in the rock, and that step would be shortened. We'd work until we became too tired to continue. Then B and I would trade. While one of us was working, the other would remain in the darkness and either eat or drink or lay down on the cave floor, padded by rope bags. After just a few short rotations, we were tired enough to catch a nap while taking our break. The only light we used was the helmet light on the head of the worker. Since it was pointed toward the hole, the resting person was left mainly in the dark. This was a welcome benefit since the resting person was usually well resting. The rest break was also a chance to cool down a bit, which didn't take long in the cooler temperature of the cave. Fortunately, the temperature of the cave allowed us to work pretty hard and not overheat much. I remember that I frequently looked in the hole and thought, hey, it's big enough, I think I can squeeze through, only to be disappointed in my attempt. However, even after the first attempt and failure, I knew that I would keep working on the hole until I got through. This even though I knew it would take many more hours of hard work. It actually became an obsession for me. I tried to get out to the cave and work as often as I could. I hoped the passage led to a more enormous, undiscovered cave that we would be the first to enter. I guess the explorer in me wanted to find a new frontier there in the cave. Since B is such an avid caver, he was motivated by the same desire to find an unexplored cave. What we did find was not at all what I expected. February 10th, 2001. Scarcely 2 weeks had gone by and already we were on our way back out to work in the cave. We admit we've become obsessed with the idea of getting through the passage. That may be a sign of how exciting our lives really are. It's not that we think there's going to be something great beyond the passage, it's just we like the idea of being the first humans on the face of the planet to set foot in a virgin part of the cave. If we found a hidden treasure, that would be fine with us. We got a late start and we drove part of the way in the dark. When I tell people that I go caving at night, they wonder why. They don't stop to think that it's always night once you're inside the cave. All the way out to the mystery cave, we talked about new ideas to speed up our work. He also told me he spoke to some cave friends of his that came up with an explanation about the rumbling noise. He thought it might be the sound of water deep within the cave, possibly a waterfall. I couldn't really explain why some of the noise seemed to come and go. To me, it's just one more reason to get through so we can solve the mystery. On this trip we took Bee's dog, Whip. She's a Jack Russell Terrier. I was not at all concerned about taking the dog into this cave. We'd taken her before. She answers to the call of nature before we go in, and then waits until we get out again. Also, she is well behaved inside the cave. We simply had to lower her via custom-made harness until she reached the bottom of the main drop. Then she negotiated the rest on her own. She loves to explore but won't go out of our sight. She doesn't have a light attached to her, so she has to wait for us. Another reason I didn't mind bringing Whip along was we all planned on putting her in a small hole to see how far into the passage she would go. That might give us an idea of what's on the other side. We knew that if there were a drop-off that we couldn't see, the dog would turn around and come right back out. We thought we might have to do some work on the hole before even the dog could get through. Bee's dog Whip near the entrance of the cave. Despite working in the dark of night, we could rig up and get down pretty quickly. We didn't take as many tools as last time, plus we left some in the hole so we wouldn't have to haul them out and back again. I did manage to get 2 more batteries for the drill, for a total of 4. Also a few more masonry drill bits. Even with the dog, we made pretty good time getting down. When something bizarre happened they can't quite explain. The dog began exploring as soon as we let her off the rope. She was in hog heaven, sniffing and darting around about our feet. She would run from one person to the other as we made our way back to the work site. At this point, the cave splits into 4 passages and the dog seemed to run out of juice. She just stuck right by either B or me. That seemed kind of odd. As we progressed further in the cave, she would only stay by B. She seemed edgy, like she saw something she didn't like. As we approached a short drop-off before the hole, she stopped and would only come further after coaxing her. The hair on her back stood on end. Finally, as we got within 20 feet of the hole, she began to whimper and hide behind B. Her tail was between her legs and she was cowering on the ground. Strange, I've seen her square off with dogs twice her size, but now she acted as if Satan himself lurked in the darkness. I figured there must have been animals that used this cave as a home, and Whip smelled their scent. Too bad it upset her because there's no way she was going into the passage. We decided that one of us would work with this new development, the nervous dog, while the other would stay with the dog a few feet away from where we usually rested. We got right back to our routine of drilling and hammering, etc. With our extra supply of batteries, we could really push hard on the drill and not have to worry about using up the batteries. This didn't make our work any more accessible, but it did speed things up slightly. Progress was still slow. I really didn't mind, though. My journal goes on for a bit about the progress we were making. The entire time we worked, Whip did not move. She just laid there on the rope bag, shivering. She would whimper from time to time. One thing I didn't think about at the time was how she would not take her eyes off the hole. We should have been more observant of this intuitive animal. We're on our 4th battery when a second bizarre thing happened to us. B was working. He had just finished drilling a hole and was getting ready to hammer with a bullpen when he stopped working and looked into the hole. I was kicking back almost asleep, hardly paying attention to B. He had a light by his side to illuminate the work area. I could see in the eerie glow a puzzled and intense look on his face. He looked over at me and shook his head. I asked him what was up, and he said he swore he just heard a strange noise emanating from the hole. He said it sounded like a rock sliding on the rock, sort of like a grinding sound. I assumed his ears were just ringing from the drill. He didn't wear any earplugs on this trip. He assured me he heard what he said. I didn't have an explanation, so I went back to dozing. B sat in the quiet of the cave for a long time before he resumed work. Also, he would stop from time to time and just listen. B's very grounded and not wanting to pursue some imaginary sound. I believe he heard something, but I'm not too concerned about what it was. I assume we'll figure it out once we get through the passage. The final battery lasted about an hour or so. We're sitting and talking about our progress when I decided to see if I could get my head through the hole. My head easily fit, but there was no way my shoulders were going in. As I was kneeling there contemplating how close we were, I noticed something that B overlooked. The wind had stopped, and all the other times I'd been in the cave I'd always felt the wind blowing. The last time we were out working on the cave, the wind was blowing worse than ever. Even earlier I remember the breeze cooling us off, but now, nothing. B said he didn't know when it stopped. The rumbling had ceased too. Bizarre. The plain old cave was becoming mysterious. We talked for a long time in the dark of the cave. We debated what could possibly be causing these unusual events to occur. I think part of the reason we were sitting in the dark was that we were both too hammered to move. We could come up with no reasonable explanation for the strange things happening in the cave. After sitting for at least half an hour, we slowly loaded up our gear and started for the surface. Whip couldn't have been happier to get out of there. Once again, we left some tools in the cave. We just put them in the hole. Not enough people used the shelter to worry about. Plus, we were too tired to care. We made a lot of progress on this trip. It helps to have the extra batteries. We still have a long way to go, but it sure is nice to see how far we've come. Our progress in the hole. The rest of the journal entry describes climbing out of the cave, getting a room at the motel, and crashing. We were exhausted. In retrospect, I can't believe how casual we are about everything in the cave. At the time, the only thing we could think about was getting into the passage. Everything else was just a minor distraction. I do recall thinking it would be nice to get in and see how the mechanics of the cave worked, where the wind was coming from and what was making the noise, etc. Now, weeks later, I think of my ignorance and naivety and shiver. March 3rd to 4th, 2001. Boy, they probably spent a lot of money at that motel, as if they've already been here over a month or so. But they probably saved up for this trip. It took us 3 weeks before we got back out to Mystery Cave again. Our attitudes have changed a bit since we first started on the project. In the beginning, we looked at the whole thing as a fun adventure. Since the last trip out, we found ourselves taking a more severe approach. On the drive out this time, our conversation was a little more subdued than before. We hadn't talked much since the last trip. Not for any reason, but scheduling conflicts. Instead of discussing ways of getting through the passage, we found ourselves talking about rational explanations for what had happened. Neither one of us had any ideas that would explain the unusual occurrences we experienced on the last trip. We were amused to find out that neither one of us had talked much about previous trips to other people. It was a complete reversal from the other trips. It had been fun to report to friends and family about our progress. It's always fun to tell people about the tight squeeze we have to get into the passage. Most people have little desire to voluntarily subject themselves to incredibly close places. Actually, neither do I, but I will do it to get to the other side. Good motivation. We left town early in the afternoon to beat traffic. I don't really recall what time we finally got to the cave. Like I said, the mood was subdued. We got rigged up and started down. Obviously, B left the dog home this time. We took essentially the same gear as last time. We left some of the tools in the hole to save our backs the agony of hauling the extra weight. Even with the gear, we got down in good time. We really have a sound system for getting up and down. There was only one minor mishap this trip. B scraped his arm on the descent. Not real bad, fortunately. B1 waited to get until we got all the way up to the hole to patch it up. It was just a superficial cut. While he was getting the wound cleaned up, I started working. We both took note that the breeze was back and the rumbling present. We had 4 fresh batteries and 4, maybe 3.5 fresh arms. I had high hopes this would be the day. It started out pretty slow when we first started working on the hole. The thickness was about 3 inches. As we have enlarged the spot, the consistency has increased. As a result, our progress has become slower. Still, we continued with as much energy as we could put into the work. The hole was big enough, at least for me, to put the hammer into this hole for reference. Then put the camera into the hole and take a picture of Floyd's tomb. It's challenging to get the exact feel of the tomb, but the lowest point near the back of the picture is about 7 inches high. The width is approximately 20 to 24 inches. The hammer is a small 5-pound sled. Note the abundance of rock on the passage floor. It's been nice to see a pile of broken rock below. The hole gets bigger and bigger. We both realized we were just going to have to put a certain amount of work to get through, so we just get down to business. We don't usually talk much while we work since one of us is making a lot of noise. With the drill or hammer. Break times are used to chat momentarily about whatever topic pops into mind. The breaks take place whenever the guy that's working decides to switch roles. We both put in some pretty good work sessions. I have a little more stamina than B, but he gets just as much done in a shorter amount of time due to his upper body strength. We still celebrate the small victories we encounter along the way. Whatever section we've been working on crumbles, we cheer. On the rare occasion that a fist-sized rock falls from the entrance, we whoop and holler. It's one small chunk of earth that no longer separates us from whatever lies on the other side. I still harbor the fantasy that there's a hidden entrance to the other side of the passage, and years ago Spanish explorers hid their treasures in the cave and sealed up the opening, and has remained untouched until we find it. He has a more realistic, although more mundane theory. He figures there are more caves on the other side. We'll see who's right. I wanted to see this trip out to speed up on the work by using more significant masonry bits. I purchased some good-sized ones at the hardware store at a good-sized price. One was more prominent in diameter than all the rest. The other was smaller, around, but longer. I pretty much concluded that the big one might be too big, and I was right. We tried to get it to go into the rock, but progress was plodding. We tried pushing for all we were worth, and all we got was tired. The more significant bit created too much friction area for our strength. We might have worked with a hammer drill, but we didn't have one. The more extended bit worked fine with our drilling device. We relied on it for most of the work we made on this trip, although we would be out one bit and a drill in my hand. When the bit broke off towards one end, I was pushing as hard as I could on the drilling tool with the bit a few inches in the wall when it snapped. I nearly rammed the drill through the wall from pushing so hard. We were able to retrieve the bit and keep using it, minus a couple of inches. It still worked great. Only once in a great while did we resort to hammer and chisel. Work was proceeding as normal until about the time we were on our 4th battery. I was kneeling down and working the drill slowly into the wall at the time. I had my earplugs in, my safety glasses on. I was lost in my own thoughts. Suddenly, over the squeal of drill running down the rock, I heard a strange noise. It was loud. I could listen to it over the noise of the drill tool, even though I had earplugs in. At first I thought it was just the drill doing its job on the cave. It frequently complained by screeching and whining as we forced it into the wall. But this was different. It took several seconds to comprehend that this was coming from inside the hole, and not the bit. I stopped drilling and yanked my earplugs out just in time to hear the most terrifying scream I'd ever heard trail off and echo into the darkness of the cavern. I stared wide-eyed at the hole for several moments. I didn't move, nor did I breathe. I turned to look at B. Moments earlier he had been lying on the rope bag catching a nap. Now he was standing upright, mouth open with a look of concern on his face. I turned and looked into the hole again, half expecting to see a demon face staring back at me. Nothing was different in Floyd's tomb. I fixed my gaze on the back of the squeeze where the limits of my light reached. There was no motion, only darkness beyond the reaches of my morning. In the complete silence that followed, I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Another sound could be heard in the cave. Suddenly I heard a scraping noise behind me and straightened up. I nearly knocked myself out, hitting my head on the overhang. It was just B moving to turn on his light, but I was so wired it almost sent me to my grave. B spoke again and I jumped. He said to get some rocks and put them into the hole. He explained that whatever animal had made that noise might be able to get through the hole. I immediately grabbed a few rocks and hoisted them through the opening. Using a sledgehammer handle, I slid the stones as far back into the tunnel as I could reach, creating a wall between us and the other side. Since the squeeze is so tiny, it didn't take long. However, the entire time I was doing this, I thought that the noise certainly didn't seem to come from an animal. I don't know if B really thought it was, or if he was just trying to convince himself. I didn't say anything to him about what I thought. From the time I wrote this journal entry 2 days later, I've tried to come up with some possible source for such a noise. It sounded like a cross between a man screaming in fear and a cougar screaming in pain. It said like it came from the hole was roughly 100 feet away. The horrific noise reverberated through the cave and through my ears. He estimated the scream lasted 8 to 10 seconds. My best guess is about 5 seconds. 3 seconds while I was drilling and about 1.5 seconds to drop the drill and yank the earplugs. And half a second of sheer terror. It's difficult to tell how much time passes when you're listening to a solo from the depths of Hades. After I filled the back of the passage with rocks, we just sat there listening to the silence. My breathing was a lot more rapid than usual. Neither of us spoke for quite some time. Finally, B suggested we get back to work and keep an eye out for movement in the hole. We put a light in the passage and shined to the back of Floyd's tomb. It was only at this point we realized the wind had stopped again and the rumbling could no longer be heard. To say I was nervous would be an understatement. I didn't say anything to B, nor him to me. Back to drilling, B took over the work, which was fine with me. I wasn't precisely worn out, but I didn't mind being further from the hole. B would stop from time to time and listen. I just sat watching him with my light on. I wasn't close to the entrance to the hole, but I still found myself looking back behind me down the passage and to the still water. Every time my light would cast an unusual shadow, my heart would jump. Imagination was running wild. Oddly, B seemed to be less concerned about the strange noise than me. After a short time, he appeared to be focused entirely on getting through the passage. I was still straining to listen above the sound of the drill. I heard nothing but the now familiar sound of carbide on stone. As I contemplated the possible scenarios which might play out on the other side of the passage, I found myself strangely getting somewhat excited again about getting through. It might have been fatigue taking its toll on my mind, the thought of something valuable on either side. My thoughts were broken when B let out a yell, possibly a cuss word. B said the drill battery was dying, but he hadn't entirely broken off the large relative section he was working on. He set the useless drill aside and picked up a hammer and bullpen. He started wailing away at the hole created by the bit. After nearly 10 solid minutes of hammering, he sat back against the rock, sweating and nearly out of breath. The bullpen was still protruding from the cave wall. He held the hammer toward me, inviting me to take a few swings. I held up my hand and shook my head. I'd been ready to exit the cave for quite a while now. He didn't press the issue, and without speaking, we both started gathering the gear we were going to take out. Once again, we stashed some of the tools in the passage. I was the first to start toward the top of the cave. Several times I had to stop and wait for B, not because he was moving slow. I was just more than eager to get out. A few times I felt better than night, steeping out into the chilly night air. The journal talks about the rest of the evening, our dinner, our decision to get to a motel and come back the next day, a lengthy discussion on the strange sounds we'd heard, another mediocre night's sleep. I cannot believe we were so willing to get right back into the cave after hearing the scream. Part of the reason I went along with the idea is that B seemed indifferent to any possible dangers. Even if it were an animal, which I didn't believe it could, but could offer no better explanation, weren't we possibly putting ourselves in harm's way? In retrospect, I still have difficulty understanding our thought process at the time. We were just too eager to discover virgin cave passages. I now think it could be summed up with one word: testosterone. February 13th. It's amazing what a couple of good meals and a little sleep can do for someone's attitude. Even though we still had memories of the strange noise fresh in our minds, we relit our fire of enthusiasm. The other side of the passage seemed so close, we were sure this would be the day. We got into the cave and started to work our way down the hole. Getting back into the darkness of the shelter brought back the memories of the night before. The sight of the circle of rock illuminated by our headlamps, the smell of dirt in the air, the sound we made as we crawled across the stone. Once we reached the entrance to Floyd's tomb, however, we were once again ready to blaze the trail leading to an undiscovered part of the cave. We immediately noted the presence of the breeze blowing out the hole and rumbling. The bullpen sticking out of its hole was an obvious sign of where we needed to begin work for the day. B took over where he had left off the day before. I took up residence in the same spot and I occupied the night before, even though I was already well rested and wanting to start work. B was making the hammer sing with each blow. After a mere 2 to 3 minutes, he let out a cheer. turned to reveal a handful of rocks that used to be attached to the cave. He was breathing heavy and had a big smile on his face. So I did, too. The strange noise had been forgotten for the time, and the vision of success captured our attention. The size of the opening at this point. The lower left-hand corner of the hole gave us grief because of the thickness of the wall at that point. We felt if we could just remove that corner, we might be well on our way inside. B now held his hand. The crumbled remains of the corner. Our excitement consumed us as we examined the hole. I took the hammer and pounded away at the surface of the hole. The idea was to remove the jagged edges that would take their toll on my skin. The size looked right. Now the moment we'd been looking for. I cautiously approached the entrance to Floyd's tomb. I decided the best way to enter the small hole was to place one arm over my head, turn my head sideways, and slowly work my way in. I soon determined this was not going to work. The hole was small. If I was going to make it in without widening the gap anymore, I was going to have to put both arms over my head in dividing position, turn my head sideways, and slip into the tomb. The width of the entrance was the limiting factor. The height was sufficient. The arms overhead position flared my shoulder blades out, but there was still no room to get in. But there was still room to get in. Plus, the arms overhead gave me the best squeeze side to side. To enter straight into the hole, I stood on my feet and bent over to get level with the entrance. My knees were bent in a position that was uncomfortable. Sort of semi-squatting position, bent at the waist with arms overhead. Plus, I had to slightly turn my upper torso to the left in a counterclockwise rotation and negotiate the entrance angle. I'll be honest, I'm getting claustrophobic vibes just reading this and imagining how that would be like for me. Notice in the last photo, see the wikia, that the entrance generally slopes up to the right. I got my arms through the entrance with minor scrapes. Next came my head, but keeping it turned sideways, I could get it in, for the most part up to my shoulders. When I got to my shoulders, I could feel the rocks touching all around my shoulders and chest. This was not stopping me, but I was definitely scraping many surfaces of my body. I decided to just push through, keeping in mind I would have to come back out eventually. The pain was not too bad, and I was in. Well, my upper body was in, at least. I could get an idea of what the tomb was going to be like. Here's a flattering photo of my best side. See the wikia. Note the size of the area we had to work in. The ledge overhead was an obstacle. Once inside the tomb, I had a few inches all around me to position my body. This is the most significant part of the passage, and it was conveniently located right at the beginning of the crawl. It gave me a little room to get positioned and crawl further into the path. Inside the tomb gave me a whole new outlook on what it would be like to crawl through. Even though this is the most significant part of the crawl, it was still small. I could move my head around freely, but it was a wall of solid rock in every direction that I turned. When I spoke to B, my voice sounded muffled, like talking in a small box. I could rest my chest on the passage floor, but the rocks were uncomfortable. I turned my head to look further ahead, but couldn't see past the wall of stones I had built the day before. The squeeze toward the end of the passage was closer now and appeared even narrower. I didn't know if I could squeeze through or not. I knew it would be close, so I wanted to crawl further into the passage. First, however, I had to get to work with some of the loose rocks lying in the passage floor out of my way. I was disappointed to find that most of the stones that looked loose were attached to the bottom. I was hoping to be able to just scrape them out of the way. I'd pushed the sledgehammer to the passage before me, so at this point, I used it to go to the rock wall we had made further back in the path. Then I dragged the sled back and forth across the floor to move any loose rocks and break up the solid ones. By sliding the head of the hammer under the squeeze, I determined that the narrowest part of the squeeze was about 7 inches high. I figured we'd have to do some work before I could slip through. The entire time I had my head in the passage, B was just kicking back listening to my descriptions and progress reports. At some point he snapped the photos shown above. Thanks, B. See the wiki again for the photos. Up to this point, the size of the passage was not too big of a deal. I was in a tiny path, but only my upper body was in. And since it was the most significant part of the passage, my arms could move freely. I was pretty calm. Then it was time for a push. I slid the sledgehammer up as far as I could reach. Since my body filled the entrance, I could not slip the tool out, so it was easier to just push it ahead. To rotate my hips to the proper angle to enter the hole, I had to lean my upper body on my forearms and use my feet to climb the wall outside the spot and slowly crawl into the hole. My hips barely fit. Once they cleared the entrance, I could relax a bit and get in position toward the squeeze. I decided to try the one-arm forward technique to get through. The passage was so narrow, I would have to stay in whatever position I started with to get through the entire length. There was just no room to move around or change it. I would also have to turn my head one way or the other and keep it in the same position. The crawl was tight. That's what she said. Moving forward at this point in the passage was relatively easy. I could use my forward arm, my left arm, to pull and my other arm to push. At the same time, I would wiggle my body, trying to arch as much as I could to keep my chest off the rocks. I tried both ways and determined I would turn my head to the right. I felt the most comfortable. I began to learn things as I went. I decided that the small flashlight in one hand would be excellent. This was a tricky maneuver because I had to look overhead since my head was turned. It became immediately apparent that we would have to do some more work in removing the rocks from the passage floor. As I moved along the surface, I was constantly scraping my chest on the rocks. They were sharp and it was painful. Occasionally I would cause a rock to slide under my chest and actually wedge it between me and the top of the passage. Then I'd have to back up and try to move the rock with my cheek and use a sweeping motion with my head or back way out and carrying it with my forward hand. A little trip into the passage represented a significant milestone into my caving career. When I began caving, I didn't feel overly comfortable going through tight spaces. Even a little squeeze at the beginning of the cave was an obstacle to overcome. By pushing myself and forcing myself to try the narrow passages, I've become much calmer about tight spaces. Still, the passage represented a new benchmark in small areas. I've not been faced with anything this small. I don't remember having to take off my helmet before now. For this passage, it is mandatory. As I mentioned before, not only do I have to take off my helmet, but I have to turn my head to the side to fit. The journey into the tomb went like this. After I twisted my hips into the passage, I took a few minutes to stop and work out the game plan. Most of the length of my legs was still outside the entrance. They were just dangling in the air. The tomb was still big enough to move my head around and even move my arms freely into position. It was more significant than the rest of the passage, but not by much. It was like sticking your head into a box. Oh goodness, I got a lot of boxes around me, but you probably can't see them. You might be able to see a couple of them, though. Everywhere I looked, there were rocks and not too far from my head. Any sound I made was muffled and dead. The narrowest part of the passage was 10 feet in. At this point, I was about 3.5 feet in, about 4-foot mark, and I would have to commit to whatever position I felt comfortable in and stay that way until the 12-foot mark, at which time the cave started opening up. I went with my left arm forward and head turned to the right. B had given me a flashlight that I held in my left hand. As I inched forward, I would try to brush the loose rocks away with my left arm. This was somewhat successful, but there were a lot of stones I missed or could not move. As mentioned, the first little bit of the crawl moved along fairly quickly since there was a little room above me to negotiate the passage. Then the walls started to close in around me. I had a few extra inches on each side of me, but the top of the crawl was getting very low. At about the 7-foot mark, I could feel the top rubbing on my back as I would arch. After another half-foot, I couldn't arch anymore. I just had to push ahead with my toes and pull with my forward arm. I decided it'd be an excellent time to see if I could back out. I tried it and it was pretty easy. It gave me a lot more confidence still. I had B tie the webbing to my feet just in case he had to pull me out. Last shot before my feet were all the way in. Note the webbing B tied at my request. See the Wikia for any pictures. My neck was starting to get sore from being cranked to the side. My head was getting heavy, but to rest it, the only option I had was to lay it down on the broken rocks. It was painful, but I did it frequently. I was staring at the wall to my right, a mere 4 to 5 inches from my face. Most of the time, I wasn't watching the border. Either I had my eyes closed, which I sometimes do when I go through a tight spot, or the light wasn't shining in a direction that did me any good. It was tranquil in the tomb, other than my own breath. I was breathing heavily from the effort it took to move. Thankfully, the breeze was pleasant and cooled me off. By lifting my head and carefully touching the ceiling from time to time, I could gauge the size of the passage that my body would soon pass through, much like a cat using its whiskers to estimate an opening in a fence. At the 7.5-foot mark, I could tell things were about to get really tight. While I was lying in the darkness, in a passage deep within a cave, one is in a unique position to ponder. A mountain literally resting on top of me, the entire earth lying below. One tiny movement of land and I would cease to exist, or worse, to recognize the fear shared by Floyd Collins as he lay there, trapped for days deep within the heart of Mother Earth, incapable of freeing himself from his earthen prison. Picture yourself in my position. Lying on your stomach, your left arm is extended over your head, your right arm is at your side, having only a few inches in which to move. Your arms and hands are sore and bleeding from crawling and pulling yourself across broken rocks. Your entire body is resting on the rocks. Your neck gets tired of holding your head off the rocks, so you gently rest your cheek on the rock to rest. Once you start again, you have to push with your toes to scoot your body forward, sliding across the rocks. After moving a few inches, you're breathing hard and have to rest. As you inhale, you can feel your back pressing hard against the top of the squeeze. It takes several minutes before you recover enough to push forward. The entire time you're laying there, you think of how you'll get back out and what if. Well, that's pretty much what I was going through at this point in the passage. I decided it would be an excellent time to throw a photo of the squeeze. The image was actually taken on a different trip, but it shows how tight things were at that point in the passage. Now, with my head turned to the side, not by choice, as you could see how I would rest my cheek on the rocks. You can also see how difficult it is to look ahead of me. Arms are pinned to my side. I later determined that that would be the best position. There's virtually no space between the top of the passage and my back. Tight, not for the claustrophobically inclined. Gee, you don't say. Floyd's tomb. When I reached the point where my back was rubbing, I could feel with my head the passage was not getting any bigger. I knew I'd most likely not get through. Still, I decided to give it one more push. If I'd been in this position a year ago, I would have been in a state of panic, but not today. I was pretty pumped. I took a few minutes to rest and then I went for it. I exhaled all the hair in my lungs completely. This caused my chest to collapse enough to scoot forward a few inches. Because it takes so much effort to rush, I only went a few inches before I had to stop and breathe. As I inhaled, my chest pressed hard against the floor and my back against the top. It took a little longer to get my breath back. Unbelievably, I did it again. Exhale, scoot, rest. Again, only a few inches, repeat. I took a few minutes to enjoy this position, pinned in the small passage, while I could not believe how relaxed I was. I tried one more time to exhale and scoot. My back was rubbing too much to continue. Despite the failed effort, I was psyched. It took several long minutes to lay there and recover from the action. He had been encouraging me the entire time. It was fun to hear him cheer as he saw my shoes get deeper and deeper in the hole. Backing out was not too difficult, but it did take some work. I encountered the same obstacles as when I went in. After I wiggled my hips out of the hole, which took some time, I had trouble getting my shoulders out. Both arms were overhead at this point. My shirt was getting caught on the rocks, and my shoulders were brushing the sharp rocks. After struggling to find a good position, I gave up and just pulled my upper body out. Scrape! My shirt pulled up over my head, and I had some nice scrapes on my shoulders, but I didn't care. To me, the trip was a success. I pushed myself beyond what I thought possible. I kneeled at the entrance and looked into the narrow passage I had just been in. Rockwell was now at the 11-foot mark. I pushed a little with my forward arm. The smallest point was the 9-foot mark. We were close. Between the work and the excitement, I was tired. I just sat on the rope bag grinning. Whew, what a trip. Our progress on the hole. The rest of the journal entry talks about the usual. Our climb out, dinner, trip home, etc. We brainstormed and came up with some ideas that would help us get through on our way home. We both invented some tools to remove the rock and on the floor deep in the passage. We were both very excited about this trip. I from pushing my limits in the cave, and B from his success in climbing out of the cave. This was the first time he could climb all the way out without the help of climbing devices nor my service. It was a personal success that showed the progress he had made since his accident. Pretty cool. I remained amazed that we could so easily forget the terrifying moment we experienced just the day before. All had been forgotten, with the strange noise being blamed in our minds on some rational, harmless explanation. April 7th, 2001. Before going back out to Mystery Cave again, we spent a lot of time preparing. We made a squeeze box, a wooden box, the opening of which can be adjusted in size. We could then crawl through the door and measure how tight of a squeeze we could fit through. From there, we were able to determine that I would need about 8 inches in height to get through the most minor portion of Floyd's tomb. That meant we'd have to scrape out about an inch from the floor of the passage. We also learned that the best position I would need to get through the path would be on my stomach with my arms at my side. Of course, my head would be turned up one way or the other. That position allowed my shoulder blades to drop to their lowest point. To move, I would push forward or backward with my toes. It sounds complex, but it felt adequate. Later, it proved to work sufficiently. We did prepare the second thing to construct the tools we invented to work with in the cave. I came up with a clever way to chip away inside the passage without climbing inside. I had my neighbor weld together several lengths of steel pipe in a manner that would allow us to take it apart while we climbed down to the tomb, but still have enough strength necessary to hold up to a blow from a hammer once it was together. We made our own trips to screw into our pipe and reached the area we needed to work on. Pete came up with an excellent design for the scraper using an angle iron. He had his neighbor weld it together. It proved an invaluable tool for scraping and removing the rock. We're both proud of our inventions. I also made a device to hold my drill and was attached to our pipe. We ended up not using it since the scraper device worked so well. Here's a picture of B edited to protect his identity with the pipe we made. I took the picture facing away from the tomb. He's sitting on the rope bag that we used as a bed. Behind him to his left is the passage that leads down to the still water. Behind him to his right is the last drop-off before the path. You can see some orange webbing we used to climb down and up. All pictures available at the wiki if you hadn't heard it the last 5 times I said it. I took an oath. I made a vow. I would not leave the cave until I made it through the passage, conquered Floyd's tomb, and we would leave this would be the trip. It had been a long time since we'd been out to Mystery. We'd been busy, though. We'd made the tools we talked about. It was fun coming up with ideas for tools. Also, we made a squeeze box to determine the best technique for getting through the tight spot. Plus, we knew how much rock we needed to remove before we could get through. We were excited to get back out to the cave and finish our project. Our climb down the passage took a little longer than usual since we had extra tools to carry. Once we got down the path, we immediately got to work using B's scraping tool with the pipe I'd made. It worked like a charm. We could hammer the tube on one end and the scraping tool on the other dug into the rock. We could then push the debris all the way through the passage and out of our path. We'd then turn the scraper sideways in the passage and observe the clearance when we needed to measure our progress. We worked for about 2 hours before I had any desire to try the tomb. I just wanted to make sure I was going to make it through on the first try. We made one more sweep at the passage floor, clearing any loose rocks from where I'd be crawling and pushing the wall we'd made back to the back of the squeeze. I made preparations for the crawl by fashioning duct tape suspenders to prevent my shirt from sliding around while sliding across the rock. I went with a flashlight in my hand, even though my writing would be at my side. I knew I would need it once we got through. As an expression of faith, I did not tie a rope to my feet. I was confident I was going to make it. Finally, I made an attempt. Although I didn't mention it in my journal, we did notice the breeze was back and the rumbling present. Since we didn't do any work to the entrance, I had to go through the same dance routine to even enter the passage. Once I got my upper body through the hole, I shined the flashlight ahead of me to work out a plan of attack. The path didn't seem any more significant than the last time I was there, but most of the work was done further in the squeeze. I paused for a few moments and then twisted my hips to get my lower body in. I slowly inclined forward as my entire body filled the passage. Before I was entirely in, I got into the position for the push. I dropped both my hands to my side and turned my head to the right, then began to inch forward. Once my toes were inside the cave, I used them to push forward. To keep from scraping my body, I would walk using my shoulders, knees, and toes. Progress was slow but steady. This was fine by me. A foot or two before the tight spot, I could already tell there was little more room. Even so, I began to touch the roof of the passage with my back. This time, however, I was able to continue moving forward. I reached the lowest point in the path, and I could tell it would still be tricky. Even with the work we had done in clearing out the loose rocks, I still felt sharp pebbles rolling under my chest as I slid along. When I could feel my back brushing the top of the passage in several places, I reverted to my exhaling technique. Before I began, however, I took a moment to lay there in the path. I could see the glow of B's flashlight as the rays of light managed to squeeze past my body. I could feel the cool breeze evaporate, the drops of dirty sweat on my forehead. I could feel 1,000 sharp edges dig into the surface of my skin. I felt the twinge of excitement as I realized that the goal we'd set out to achieve weeks ago was about to be discovered. This thought alone made me want to keep moving, no matter how tight the passage became. I breathed in and out rapidly for a few moments, then began. Exhale, scoot, stop to catch my breath, repeat. After just a few inches of scooting, I could raise my hand off the floor of the squeeze until that the passage was beginning to open up. I relayed this information to B, and we both took a few seconds to celebrate. During the rest of the slide through the passage, B was cheering me on. Virgin Passage! And Neil Armstrong territory were the phrases he kept repeating. I was grinning ear to ear. Even though the passage was beginning to get larger, it was still slow going. I had to continue scooting along for another 1.5 feet before I could slide my arms underneath me to use them to crawl. At that point, I felt my journey was essentially over. I could sit up slightly and move the rock wall we had erected several trips ago. Those rocks served as a somber reminder that a bit of caution would be wise. I shouted back to B that I was through. We both take a moment to congratulate ourselves on our success. B would likely never squeeze through a passage and see what I was seeing, so I gave him a description of what the cave looked like. At this point, I only had my mini-mag, so I could not see very far into the passage. The end of the path made a gentle right turn and seemed to go for a ways. I was unable to do anything at this point but sit due to the size of the passage. All the broken rocks we had pushed through Floyd's tomb were around me at this point. There were no other signs of human intrusion. I had to wait until B passed me my helmet light to better feel for the cave. B used a pole we made to slide me the end of the rope. There I was able to pull all my gear through the squeeze. First thing he sent me through was my helmet and light. After I got the light fired up, I was able to see our new section of the cave. Ours. It was an exciting experience to see the results of hours of hard work for several weeks. At this point, we still had no idea what the cave had to offer. The only thing I could see was the passage immediately following the squeeze. It was a narrow passage with a low ceiling. I would easily be able to get through it, but I would have to crawl. I began taking pictures so I could show B. The first section of the new passage, I was almost lying down since the path was so small. My feet are extended in front of me, as you can see. Notice the broken rock on the floor of the cave. The passage looks like a dead end, but it turns gently to the right near the end. I asked B how far he thought I should venture to the new cave in the light of the strange events. For the first time, he too toned down his enthusiasm as he remembered the noises. He slid the pipe through the tomb and loosened tip on the end. He said I could use it as a weapon if I ran into an animal or ellipses. He also told me to make sure we could hear each other as I progressed in the cave. Even though we were at least thinking of possibly running into trouble, we never really considered the fact that if I got into trouble, B would never be able to rescue me. In fact, no one would be able to get me for many hours. If I were in serious trouble as in hurt, there was no way anyone would be able to get to me in time. But symbolic of the whole experience, we were focused on our goal and not the potential dangers we faced. So far, we had dodged the proverbial bullet. So far. I strapped on my gloves and knee pads and grabbed my camera and began my adventure. I crawled through the passage pictured above, which is about 20 feet long. The next portion was about 40 feet long. In addition to having a higher ceiling, the walls were a little wider than the section I just crawled through. Both areas were relatively straight. The floor was covered in a type of rock that crunched as I crawled and then walked across it. The walls were basically the same as much of the mystery cave except pristine. It was obvious no one had been there before me. Upon closer examination of the walls, I found two delicate types of formations. The first resembled several chunks of grated cheese tied together on one end, with the rest of the cheese just flopping down. The second formation was just tiny strands of rock, thinner than a human hair. It looked pretty cool. I found several examples of both kinds of shapes. I was not even through the second section of the cave, and I could barely hear B. Cave passages are not very acoustically friendly. I shouted to him that I would go for half an hour, then return. He said he'd be fine and be careful. I then proceeded to explore some more. I could walk nearly upright at this position. I was on the third straight section of the cave when I discovered a crystal formation on the wall to my right. It was in several layers on the wall, resembling a clear candle wax allowed to melt and drip down the wall. There were several small stalactite-looking formations formed by these crystals. The longest was about 4 inches in length. There would have been one much longer, judging by the size of the base, but it had broken off. I looked to see if I could locate where it ended, but I couldn't find it. The crystal formations are right behind the rock, the upper right-hand corner of the photo. I could walk upright, but I had to stoop on occasions, like ducking under that rock. Passages continued on for another 100 feet or so before the cave opened up a little. It was at the end of the short, straight segment of the cave. At the very end of this piece, it made a bend to the left and opened up into a room. Just at that point where the room began, the round rock appeared to be leaning against the wall. It seemed odd, but singular formations are common in caves, so it is unique. I'd crawled and stepped over several large chunks of rock and fell down from the ceiling, but this one was more round than the others. Once past the rock, the room opened up to a height of 15 feet. It was about 15 feet in width and 30 feet in length. At the far end of the room was another passage leading straight out. As I entered the room, I had an eerie feeling. It was like the old saying that I felt like I was being watched. Once more, the excitement of the find faded, and the memories of the mysterious side of the cave crept back into my mind. Suddenly, I felt very alone. Fortunately for my ego, I was nearly out of time and had to get back to B before my half hour was up. I took several pictures of the room. I was just going to get a feel for how long the following passage was when something caught my attention. On the left side of the room, I discovered what appeared to be hieroglyphs on the wall at about eye level. It was a single drawing that almost seemed to be just part of the rock coloration. It looked like very crude representations of people standing below a symbol. I was pumped. This meant there just had to be another entrance to this cave. Even if the entry was closed or blocked, it might mean an opportunity to open it and get B into the cave. I took another look at the drawing to make sure I could describe it to B. I then took more pictures and headed back to B. When I got back to the squeeze, I could barely talk fast enough to let B know everything I had discovered. He was just excited to hear about our newly found treasures. As we debated our next move, I began to send my gear back through the tomb to B. I told him it would be best if we got someone else to come back with me if something happened. He agreed. Once I got all my gear, though, I was faced with the wonderful task of negotiating Floyd's tomb again. Theoretically, a person should be able to get out the passage he crawled through just by simply reversing what he'd just done. If he contorts his body, a sure way to get in, he should get into the same position to get out. In practice, that may not prove to be possible or practical. Such was the case with the tomb. I determined in advance I would attempt to go head first back into the squeeze. I knew I could definitely make that by going feet first, but that would mean backing up all the way through the tomb. That would take a long time and be very exhausting. My only concern going head first was when I got to the end of the squeeze, I'd have to go through a hole that we had made without the benefit of being able to twist my body. Oh well, I chose to go head first and deal with the exit when I got to it. I started to squeeze very close to the tight spot, so at least I would have it over with soon. It turned out to be tricky getting through. I had to shift my hips to the right a little to get through, but I just kept plugging away at it. My hands were once again by my side, my head was turned to the right, and I was scooting with my toes. Once again, using my head as a gauge to tell when I was at the tight spot and when I was past it. I seemed to be getting tired a little quicker on the way out. It must have been from all the work we had done to get through. I was a little over halfway through when something bizarre happened. I was lying and taking a brief break when I heard a sound deep within the cave. It was faint but distinct sound of rocks sliding on the rock. My blood froze in its veins. I couldn't move. I just lay there straining to hear the sound again. Nothing. I quickly began to scoot toward the exit. I mentioned the sound to B, but he did recall one of our earlier trips where B said he'd heard the same thing. The task of getting out of the hole turned out to be as painful as I thought it would be. I had to put my arms overhead and force my shoulders through the hole. I definitely left some skin behind as I slipped through. He helped me as I wiggled my upper body out of the passage. Then I could catch myself and ease my lower body out of the tomb. I was out. Bee and I shook hands and began to load up our gear. I tried to listen to any sounds coming from the hole, but we were making too much noise gathering our stuff. As much as I looked forward to getting into the passage, it was a relief to get back out. This is pretty much how I feel about caves in general. I love to go in, but I feel good when I can get back out again. Something strange happened with the pictures I took in the new part of the cave. The pictures I took in the passage leading up in the large room all turned out to be just okay. Strangely, none of the photographs taken in the room turned out. Pictures of the round rock and, more importantly, pictures of the hieroglyphs I saw, images taken before and after the room, turned out great, but the negatives of the photos I took in the room were clear. Nothing. I remember what the hieroglyphs looked like, so I drew a picture to give you an idea what I saw. It's a crude drawing of what I saw, but it's accurate. First thing I saw when I saw it was Blair Witch Project. It has kind of the same feel to it. The symbol is in the center, and the several figures that look like people raising their hands were below this. April 14th, 2001. This is the last picture before I entered the large room. At the end of the passage, partially hidden in the shadows, I saw the round rock. Here's the same picture as the round rock outlined. You can't really tell from these pictures what you're looking at, but they're the only ones I got out of the round rock. Only a couple days elapsed before B found someone who wanted to explore the passage with us. B told me he talked with a few other people who couldn't make it because of the scheduling conflicts. He said they really grilled him for information about the cave and about the passage. He would not tell them which cavern to ensure that we explored it to our satisfaction before making it known to the public. Even the guy who ended up going with us did not know which cave until we were very close to it. And he was sworn to secrecy, would never reveal the cave's location to anyone on the planet. Well then, I won't identify him by name, but we'll refer to him as Joe. Joe, B, and I set out in the morning to make sure we could spend all the time we wanted in the new passage. When we got into the cave, we were able to rig up and descend rather quickly. It helps when you don't have to haul a hardware store down into the cave. Joe was impressed by our work. Even B and I took a moment to pat ourselves on the back for all the hard work we put in, and for the fact we made it through. Joe is a relatively thin caver who has had a lot of experience in caves. He said this might be the tightest squeeze he'd been in, but it doesn't bother him. I knew that physically Joe would be able to make it since I was fatter than him, and I made it. He was just as excited as us to get through and get caving, maybe more. He quickly got ready and was waiting to hear what the plan of attack was going to be. I figured I would send him through first since he was ready. He would follow, B would pass our gear through and wait for us outside the passage. He would give us 2 hours to return. It was nice of B to get down to the cave and babysit us. It's boring sitting there in the cave. With our plan set, we were ready to roll. This was perhaps irresponsible of us not to tell Joe about all the unexplained events that occurred in the cave after we'd gone through. But what exactly do you tell someone? How many of these weird things did we need to reveal to him? We did not feel we were in any danger, or we would not go in the cave ourselves. So we didn't tell him a thing before he entered Floyd's tomb. Of course, when we did tell him afterwards, it was too late. I couldn't believe how easy Joe slipped through the passage. He said it was tight, but sure didn't look like it. Once he got in, we passed him his gear, and I started in. Even though I knew I could fit through, it was still a slow trip through the tomb. You can only go so fast when you're scooting with your toes. When I reached the tight spot of the squeeze, I had Joe snap a picture of me. I thought it'd make a good photo. Once I got through, B started to relay my stuff to me. Then disaster struck. I'd gone all the way in and turned around to pull my gear through. I had to kneel down and still crouch down low. I just got my helmet, ironically, and my light. I was turning around to feed the rope back to B when I smacked my head on the top of the passage. Human skull versus solid rock. Rock 1. I told B what had happened, so he sent my first aid kit through. I was bleeding, but even worse. I didn't feel too good. I patched myself up. I then told Joe I didn't think I'd better continue. He looked like a little kid who was told that Christmas would be cancelled. Well, I didn't like the idea of him exploring the cave without me, for selfish reasons, of course. I wanted to at least see part of the cave for making the trip out there. I told him how far to go and how long it would take. Then I sent him on his way. As I laid there, I could hear him crawling into the darkness. His light disappeared after the first turn. I rested a minute or two, then began my journey back through the squeeze. It was disappointing to get to the cave and then not be able to explore it to its end. Actually, it's killing me. After I got through Floyd's tomb, which was painful, I sat down and munched on a Cliff Bar while B and I chatted. I told him I would pay for a motel room if he would stay overnight. Then we could see how I was doing the next day and make another attempt at the cave. I felt goofy for having smacked my head on a cave wall. He said he was willing to give another try tomorrow. He was just as anxious to put some closure to this cave as long as Joe would stay overnight. We determined to wrap things up the next day. Once this was settled, we just sat back and enjoyed the darkness. We could hear no sounds coming from the passage. The silence reminded me of the scraping noise that I attended to the last time we were out there. I brought up the subject with B since I had not explored the cave thoroughly. I could not offer any explanation to what could be making the scraping noise, or the change in the wind strength, or the rumbling of the terrible scream that we heard. Something we both wished we hadn't sent Joe into the cave alone. We went into the hole and yelled into it, "Joe!" No answer, not surprising. You can't just hear each other when you're very far apart in a cave. We nervously awaited any sounds, good sounds, that is, Joe-type sounds. The 20-minute limit we had set passed. Then 25 minutes. I really had no desire to climb back through the squeeze. My head was still throbbing. The reduction looked tighter than ever. Still, I knew I was going to have to make sure Joe was safe. Just as I was getting prepared to go back through, I saw a light deep in the passage. "Joe?" I called out nothing. "Joe?" Still no answer. The light got brighter, and I could hear the noise of someone crawling across broken rock that lined the cave. "You okay, Joe?" "No," was his weak reply. When he got to the other side of the tomb, he said he was not feeling well. He quickly took his gear off and put them in a bag so we could put it through. As I pulled the bag through the passage, he began to climb back through the tomb. We didn't even get a chance to question him about what he saw before coming back, though. He quickly slipped through the squeeze in the hole, and we finally got to a look at him. He looked terrible. His face was pale. He was out of breath. The dust that covers the floor of the squeeze left its mark on his face and clothes. He had numerous minor cuts and scratches on his face and arms, probably from his rapid exit from the passage. His eyes were open wide. We only had a brief moment to examine the change that occurred to Joe before he started to head up and out of the cave without saying a word. While Joe and B began to race for the surface, I took a moment to gather our gear. I then stopped to listen to the passage. I heard nothing and I felt nothing. The wind had stopped. Part of me wanted to get out of the cave as fast as possible, but another part of me wanted to immediately climb through the passage to find out what made this cave tick. Then was not the time, though. I still felt a bit dizzy from my injury. At the moment, I noticed B and Joe had made good time getting up the cave passage, and I was left alone. Chills ran through my body as I scurried to catch up with them. Once we got outside the cave, I figured I'd find out more from Joe, but when he got up to the final climb, he just slipped from the rope and went straight to the truck. In the light of day, he looked even worse than in the cave. B and I gathered up the rope and our gear and headed for the truck. Joe said he didn't want to stay overnight because he felt terrible, and we believed him. So we headed home. We could get no more information from Joe. He just stared straight ahead and was shaking like a leaf. He said he was not cold. We tried to question him. His answers were short. Asked him if he saw the hieroglyphs. No. Did he hear us yelling? No. Did he see the round rock? No. Did he see the crystals? No. He just said he went a little way in and started to feel sick. Something was fishy about his answers. He would have had to have seen the crystals if he got far enough into the cave that he couldn't hear us yelling, but why would he not elaborate? The rest of the trip passed in eerie silence. Joe didn't say much else. We gave him a brief outline of the strange events that happened in the cave. He didn't reply. As we were dropping off, we asked if he wanted to go back into the caverns. He shook his head and ran to his house. I tried to call him later the next day, but only got his voicemail. April 20th, 2001. In this journal entry, I briefly discussed the feelings B and I had at this point. I'd like to elaborate on those feelings and set the mood for this part of my journal. I hope I can successfully convey our exact thoughts and feelings as we contemplate our next move. If not, I'm afraid we'll appear to the average reader as ignorant, naive, or downright foolish. The cave represented the culmination of weeks of hard work, complete with an array of emotions from fatigue to fear, from anticipation to pain. From frustration to glory, to us, we were not standing on the brink of possible destruction, but instead honoring an unspoken commitment, much like the parent of a wayward child. We were not about to abandon our child out of fear of the unknown. Like it or not, this cave had become a part of us, and we must now see this adventure to its fruition. Additionally, verbose explanations aside, we were being eaten alive with curiosity. Despite the overwhelming number of unexplained occurrences we experienced, we had to go back into this cave. What was making the rumbling noise? What caused the change in wind strength, etc., etc.? All the way down to Joe. What could have possibly happened to him? What did he see or experience? We had many lengthy discussions about what our next move would be. We came to the same conclusion. We had to return to the cave. We could offer no possible scenarios that would solve the many riddles held deep within the cave. The only way we could hope to complete the puzzle would be to conquer the cave. We were going back to Mystery Cave. 2 weeks after our trip with Joe, and we were on our way back to the cave, we contacted the local cave rescue group to prepare for this trip and got permission to borrow their low-voltage two-way phone. The phone consists of 2 transceivers, a long spool of thin wire. I would then be able to unwind the wire that as I went into the passage to stay in contact with B the entire time. We also thought it would be a good idea to take a video camera into the new path. I purchased a case that would protect my video camera from dust, as well as the sharp rocks. I was more than willing to pay the cost of the extra case to make sure B got to see the entire passage. My head was doing fine. I still had to light a red line to make a spot where I tried to break the rock with my head. I never went to a doctor, but it was a harrowing experience. I've thought about what would have happened if I had been able to go into the passage with Joe. He was a changed man after he came out. I've been calling his house nearly every day trying to talk to him, but he won't answer his phone. B called his work, and his mutual friend told him Joe called in sick 2 weeks ago and hasn't been in since. He said Joe warned his boss he might be out for a while. I even stopped by his house twice. The first time it looked like someone was home, but no one answered the door. The second time his car was gone. There were no lights on. I hoped to talk to him before this trip, but it didn't work out. As we were rigging up the rope to descend the cave, I felt something for the first time. I did not want to go into the cave. It was not a feeling of foreboding. I was not receiving a premonition. I just had no desire to enter the underground world of Mystery Cave. I didn't share this feeling with B at the time. Even though I had no desire to go into the cave, I knew I had to. So I double-checked my gear and slipped over the edge of the cliff. Right from the beginning, it seemed like the cave didn't want us to be there. Nothing went smoothly. Every time we tried to clip a carabiner or tie a knot or attach something to the rope, we had to do it 2 or 3 times to get it right. Fortunately, we recognized this and made sure everything was safe and secure. As we slowly made our way down, we were continually bumping into the side of the cave, or stumbling as we walked, or dropping things. We finally reached a point where we stopped to gather ourselves before continuing. Our load was relatively light, but we were taking forever to get to the hole. Finally, we made it. We checked out the camera and the phone to make sure they survived the trip. We tested everything, and I gathered the gear I wanted to take into the passage. Then it was time. We looked at each other but said nothing. Then I turned out to face the path. As I twisted, my body began entering the tomb. I desperately hoped it would be the last time I'd contort my body and enter this claustrophobic nightmare. The trip through Floyd's tomb went smoothly, figuratively speaking. After I got through, we took several minutes to get everything passed through to me. I got suited up and tested all the equipment. The phone worked like a charm. I videotaped the squeeze in the first section of the new passage. Since I'd be unable to tape while I crawled in, the plan was to crawl to the next area, then stop and film some more. I could video what I'd just been through, and then the video was what I was going to crawl through next. That way I could get each section from both ends. I started to feel pretty good about the trip. I felt a sense of personal satisfaction at providing a way for B to see the fruits of his labor. It was awkward lugging the camera and rolling the phone wire while trying to crawl. I knew it would be worth it, though. Small formations were too small to show up on the video. There'd be no problem with standard outside lighting, but with my headlight as the only light source, the effort was futile. Crystal formations turned out quite lovely. They were easily large enough and made for some pretty good footage. I took advantage of the film to stop and check the phone. It's comforting to hear someone's voice deep within the passage. We chatted briefly, then I unplugged the phone and prepared to continue. The phone resembled a regular oversized phone, more like the ones you would see in the war movies. When I wanted to talk to B, I would just plug the phone into a special jack on the wire spool. Power source was on B's end of the phone, so it was always turned on. Reception was clear as a standard phone. I continued forward. Even though our progress was slow, it was steady. Things were going pretty good until I reached the round rock. Once again, I got a strange feeling just like last time. I looked around carefully and saw nothing to be alarmed about. I proceeded to film the entire room. I got good shots of the round rock from all angles. I got the walls, the ceiling, and the floor from the best of my ability. I even got some pretty good tape of the figure on the wall. It was challenging to determine precisely what was on the video. You could definitely tell something was there. After I taped everything to my satisfaction, I moved toward the end of the room and prepared to explore new territory. The far end of the large room was a passage that led to darkness. The entrance was about a foot lower than my head, and it looked like it continued that height for as far back as I could see. I ducked into the ceiling, prepared to see new sights. The walls of the recent passage were darker than the rest of the cave to this point. The floor was made of the same type of broken rocks, the ceiling had the same kind of near-perfect arch as the old section of Mystery Cave. It almost seemed out of place in the jagged atmosphere of the cave. I could only see about 30 feet or so where the passage appeared to make a right-hand turn. It would also be an excellent place to check in with B. It took a couple of beeps before he answered the phone, but his voice was still crystal clear once he did. It sounded like he might have been snoozing. Had he been gone that long? He said he was doing fine and that I could take as much time as I needed. I thanked him and hung up. His patience has been incredible during this whole project. He spent a lot of time just waiting for me while I explored the passage. I was glad he was still willing to sit and wait. I hung up the phone and started to film the new path, then it happened. From behind me I heard a scraping noise. It was loud, it was close. It was coming from the large room I had just left. I wheeled around to face whatever had made the noise. When I did, I lost my presence of mind and stood up at the same time. Crunch, my helmet crashed into the passage ceiling. My light broke and I was buried in heavy darkness. Pain shot through my neck and down into my back. The helmet had protected my head, but the neck was nearly numb from the impact. Fear enveloped me and my knees began to weaken. I slowly and involuntarily slumped to my knees. I gently set the camera down as I started to see stars from pain in my upper back. The scraping noise lasted only a second. And now the only sound I could hear was from my panic-inspired breathing. Not only could I feel the fear thick upon my chest, but the darkness seemed to hold me into place. I felt like I was vulnerable from every direction. I wanted to turn and look behind me, to the side of me, to the front of me. Everywhere I looked, I saw black. Finally, I broke the stupor of terror long enough to reach for an alternate light source, the mini-mag on my helmet. I twisted the light to turn it on, and when I did, I nearly cried. I'd forgotten to put fresh batteries in, and now I could barely see more than a few feet. Still, it was better than nothing. I immediately began shining the light with all my might into the large room. I was trying to get a glimpse of movement in the room. Nothing. I was shaking violently as I sat there trying to figure out what to do. My mind was not thinking clearly. I honestly thought I was going to die right there in the cave for a fleeting moment. I wondered how B would ever figure out what happened to me. Then it hit me like a boulder. The phone! My mind must have been clearing up at that point because I also thought about my glow sticks. Without taking my eyes off the large room, I felt around for a pack of glow sticks. Since I was carrying the phone and video camera, I removed as much as possible from my bag. One thing I left with B was my backup headlamp. Thus I left with only the glow sticks. I found one and ripped it out of its package. I could tell something was wrong by how it sounded. It has been inadvertently broken and was now useless. I checked it on the ground and searched my pack for another one. I took my eyes off the large room only to check the passage behind me occasionally. I found another glow stick, broke it to the light to light it up. The soft green glow created eerie colors over the walls of the cave. The stick provided enough light to barely see the immediate area and provided no hint at what laid ahead. I felt in the pack once more for light source again without taking my eyes off the room. I felt a third glow stick and ripped it out of its package after breaking it to make sure it worked. I hesitated and threw the glow stick into the large room. The throw was a perfect one, and the stick sailed through the length of the room. In the brief moment the light traveled through space, I saw nothing but cave walls. The absence of anything unusual did not cease to ease my state of panic. At the far end of the room, I got a brief glimpse of the round rock as the light bounced on it. The light went behind the rock and seemed to disappear. I was still shaking, but at least I didn't see anything. Still, there was the noise. I used a glow stick to light the phone real quick and with fumbling fingers. I managed to plug the phone into the jack. I put the phone to my ear and heard nothing. The usual beeps to indicate a connection with the other telephone were not there. Terrified, I pulled the phone from the jack and reinserted it. Again, silence. The line was dead. What could have happened? I just talked to B. I just found myself nearly sobbing with fear. I knew the only way out of there was back the way I came, but something was there. The third attempt at making contact with B was met with the same results. I tried to think of another plan, but I could only focus on the memories of the grinding sound that I'd heard. In my weakened state, I slumped against the side of the passage, breathing as if I'd just finished a race, never breaking eye contact with the shadows of the large room. As my shoulder touched the wall, I had a powerful jolt of pain remind me of my collision with the roof of the cave. Despair, agony, terror. Can't say precisely how long I sat there, but my feet were tingling and my knees were sore. The pain in my back crept lower, although my neck felt no different. I resolved to make an attempt to exit this evil passage. I knew if I waited too long I would lose what little light I had. I attempted to stand, but did not have the strength. I crawled slowly to the center of the large room, dragging my pack beside me using the cave walls. I was able to slowly stand, though not straight due to my sore back. Still breathing rapidly, I advanced through the room. I wound up the phone wire as I went. My eyes were staring straight ahead, staring for any signs of movement. With every step, my light would cast ever-changing shadows on the wall, keeping me busy trying to look at everyone. My eyes burned as I realized I had not blinked for many minutes. How long had this been going on? The only sounds I could hear were the crunch of my feet on a broken rock and the wheezing of my breath as I wound the cord. I could hear the squeak of the wheel, with each turn bringing me closer to the tomb, closer to B, closer to safety. The short trip through the room took an eternity. As I passed through the crude drawing, it seemed to glow as if offering some sort of warning. I didn't know what the picture represented, but everything about this cave seemed to instill fear. Toward the end of the room, I could see a round rock dimly at the far reaches of my light. Something seemed different about it, but I couldn't tell what. When I got within a few feet, I could finally tell what had changed. It had moved. It was the sound I heard. Again, terror gripped my entire body as I realized how close I was to something. I had no choice but to continue. Still, it was not easy. I inched toward the rock, holding the glow stick ahead of me in my shaking hand, using it to pierce the darkness. I stopped just to this side of the rock and wound up the slack in the wire phone, then realized why I'd lost contact with B. The stone was now sitting on the wire. I gave it a tug and the thin wire snapped. My only hope of contact with the outside world ceased to exist when that wire broke. I never felt so alone and helpless. Buried within the earth, I had voluntarily descended to my own grave with the casket of solid rock. With the phone now useless, I set it down in the passage. My gaze fixed on the round rock, I proceeded forward. My breathing was rapid, with my throat dry and aching and my mouth dusty. With every crunch of gravel below my feet, my heart seemed to stop. No movement could be seen in the green glow of my stick. I got to the rock and peered over the top. Seeing nothing, I took several quick steps past it. When I reached the other side, I recoiled in horror from what I saw. In the side of the passage near the floor was a hole, with another path revealed. It had been covered by rock, but now it was exposed. The stone couldn't have moved by itself. I backed away from the hole and collided the opposite wall. I had not been paying attention to the pain in my back, but now it came back to me in its fury. I stared down the newly discovered passage. It now went at a 45-degree angle and continued straight as far as I could see. Several feet down, I could see the glow stick that I had thrown. It illuminated the passage through enough that I could tell the walls were reasonably smooth. The floor seemed to be the same way, unlike the rest of the cave. The path was about 3 feet in diameter as far as I could see. It would have been an easy passage to explore if I had the slightest desire to do so. Right now I wanted out of the cave and into daylight. I slowly backed away from the hole toward B. I never took my eyes off the abyss. I nearly tripped over the phone wire as I tried to leave the devil's lair. I noticed my mini-mag was practically dead, leaving me with only a glow stick. I wanted to sprint to Floyd's tomb. Just hearing another human being would help alleviate some of the fear I was experiencing. As I turned away from the large rock and hole, I felt an overwhelming sense of panic fill my soul. I felt like a legion of demons was about to attack me from behind. I felt like my salvation lay ahead of me into the darkness, and Lucifer was behind me, trying to keep me from safety. I found myself moving much faster than I should have been in that cave. My only thought was to get out as quickly as possible. I passed the crystal formation, barely even noticing the beautiful creation of nature and the green glow of my light. Every time I ducked to avoid a rock, I felt my back scream. It's a reminder of my injury. When I got to the point of the passage where I had to crawl, I flung myself out onto all fours, barely slowing down as I dropped. My hands came in contact with the cave floor. I felt an electric shock shoot all the way down my back and simultaneously down my arms. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I let out a scream. I crumpled down and lay there on the rock with new levels of pain manifesting every time I inhaled. Whimpering from fear and pain, I tried to listen to neither noise in the cave. I could feel the silence pounding in my head. I knew from previous trips that B was still out of earshot, but I was close. Forcing myself to move, I winced as I pulled on my body onto all fours and I started to progress along the cave. I still held the glow stick in my hand, but I'd ceased checking behind me. Now my focus was ahead of me. I reached the point where I could yell to B, but I didn't make a sound. I didn't want to stop long enough to talk. Finally, I reached the last stretch of the cave before the squeeze. As I was crawling toward the beginning of the tube, I called to B. He answered back. I screamed to him to get everything ready to go. He asked if I was okay, since he hadn't heard from me on the phone. He had gotten worried. I told him no, to get everything ready to go. When I reached the rope, I flipped off my helmet and shoved it in my pack. For the first time, I'd realized I'd forgotten my video camera. It was a fleeting thought. I cared no more about the camera than a passenger at the Titanic cared about a hat or coat. I tied the pack to the rope and told him to pull it through. I then told him to start heading toward the surface as soon as he pulled the string through. He asked when I screamed that there was something in the cave with us. My back ached with every move I made. I knew it didn't matter, though. I was going to get through the tomb as fast as I could. Injuries notwithstanding, I just started into the squeeze. I felt the wind of the passage increase, and with it the most nauseating stench I've ever experienced. It smelled like damp, rotting rats and putrid death. I almost started to dry heave. I pulled my shirt up over my nose to shield myself from the overpowering smell. At this point, B smelled it too. He yelled, "What is that?" He yelled at me to hurry up and get through. I told him I was coming. Then took a deep breath through my shirt and started back through. B's yelling had intensified my fear and panic as if I needed any help. I knew I could sense the urgency in getting out of this place. Still, I worked my way through. I yelled him to start up, that I would catch up with him when I got through. He said he would. He placed my glow stick inside the passage and began to climb out. This time, through the squeeze, I had no regard for the tightness of the passage. I was scraping my face, ears, arms, and shoulders. Every inch of the squeeze meant numerous scratches on my body, but I barely noticed them. My back was nearly paralyzing me with pain. Once again, I felt the rising need to vomit. The odor being delivered to my nostrils by the breeze. Halfway through the Floyd's tomb, I took a break to catch my breath. I was approaching exhaustion. My respiratory rate was through the roof. The top of the passage seemed to rest my cheek. The floor felt like broken glass opposite my cheek. As I paused briefly to recuperate, I heard the scraping noise come from deep within the cave. It continued for several seconds, then in silence. I let out a cry which startled me. I was no longer consciously reacting to the noise. The cry was a subconscious response to fear which flowed through my entire body. In panic, I began to scoot through the passage as I reached the most significant part of the tomb. I quickly slid my arms under my body to get in a position to exit our hole. I grabbed the rope and pulled with all my might. When my shoulders reached the spot they lodged, I was stuck. I dug my feet into the rocks and wiggled my way back into the passage. Then I turned my body slightly and tried again. This time I was successful in pulling my upper body through. Usually I'd carefully worked my way out since it's a 3-foot drop outside the hole. This time I kicked with my legs and pulled with my arms and plop. I dropped out of the tomb and right onto my shoulder. I tried to roll to soften the impact, but was unable to do anything more than take in the blow. Strangely, the pain was focused in my shoulder, apparently not affecting my already sore back. I rolled back onto all fours and slowly rose to my feet. The smell was much less intense outside of the passage. I grabbed the glow stick and used it to find my helmet. I began to head for the webbing to climb out while strapping my helmet. When I got to the webbing, I reached to grab hold and recoiled in horror. In the glow of the glow stick, I could see the injuries of my arms for the first time. My forearms were covered with deep cuts and scrapes. Much of my arm was covered in blood. The wounds were not deep enough to bleed freely, but rather oozed the blood. In the brief moment that I stopped, I noticed there was a silence in the cave, no sounds coming from the passage and nothing from up ahead. Once again, the feeling of being alone returned, motivating me to proceed. Climbing up the slight drop-off proved to be problematic in my condition. Having a glow stick as the only light source added to the challenge. Once on top, I scrambled to catch up with B, who was impressed with the speed of his ascent. Although I did not mention any more of my physical condition during my exit, I was hurting. With every step I took, the pain shot through my lower back and my neck. My arms were shredded, my shoulder had a nice gash in it. I honestly believe were it not for the terror I felt, I would not have the energy and motivation to climb out, but I was running on pure adrenaline. Fortunately, the adrenaline surge was about to end. I did not see or hear B until I reached a small area at the bottom of the drop. He was on the rope and climbing out as fast as he could. I could hear him moving quickly and breathing heavily. I called out to him, and his startled reaction told me he was nearly as tense as I was. He told me to get on the rope and start climbing. We both knew it would be dangerous, and not something we would ever normally do, but this was different. I stood there looking up at where the rope descended into the darkness above me. It danced around as B made his way to safety. He was out of sight, but I knew he was close. I knew the rope was my lifeline to the outside, to light, protection. Behind me was darkness, fear, and the unknown. I had a fleeting thought of the movie scene where an actor had outwitted the monster and had reached the front door of the haunted house. Just as he reaches for the knob, he hears a sound behind him, and he turns only to see. I slid the glow stick into the cord of my helmet and reached for my harness. Then I thought I would let B get a little bit higher while I pulled the rope up that would stretch down into the cave. That would make it easier to get out once we got to the top of the drop. I chose not to wind the rope around my arm since it was sore and bleeding. I just pulled it into the pile on the floor. From above I heard B warn me, "Rock!" And I ducked under the ledge as several small rocks landed on the floor near my feet. I quickly went back to pulling the rope in. I had about half of it in, about 50 feet when the string hit a snag. Ugh! It was solid. There was no way I would crawl back in to release it. So I decided to just forget the rope and get my harness and get out of the cave. Quickly I threw the saddle around me and started to buckle in it before I could secure it. I heard a strange noise at my feet. My pulse began to quicken. I looked down at the rope only to discover it was disappearing into the darkness. To my horror, something was pulling the rope back into the cave. I let go of my harness and began clawing my way up the rope. The unbuckled saddle fell to the floor. Fortunately, I held onto the ascender. At the moment, I could not think straight and began climbing out of the cave without being attached to the rope. I had climbed up many times without using the ascending device, but I was attached to the rope just in case. I was climbing as fast as my battered body could hold me up. I was in a near panic state again, and consequently was scraping, bumping, and gouging my arms and legs. As I climbed, I screamed to B that something was pulling the rope. He yelled back to hurry up. Luck was with me in that I didn't slip and fall back down into the hole. If I had, I would have bounced several times against the side of the cave before smashing onto the floor. The injuries would be fatal without the necessity of having to stop to slide the ascender up the rope. I made excellent time in getting up. I could see the rays of light above me coming from the entrance to the cave. That told me exactly where I was in the cave. I caught up to B on the ledge below where our relay point was fixed. I told him to keep going. It would only take him a few minutes, but every second would be torture because I had to wait for him to get up. I watched the rope that we just climbed up. I expected to see some creature from deep within the earth climb up and make me its lunch. The strings moved out a bit in rhythm with B's climbing, but it did not appear to have any tension on it. As I stood there waiting for B, I kept watching the rope for signs of anything bizarre. I didn't know if my heart could take any more stress, but I could not have been more wired. I tried to relax a bit to make sure I was reasoning, but my poor brain had reached sensory overload. As B reached the top of the last climb, I got ready to clip my ascender and get my sorry butt out of there. It was when I noticed the rope began to tighten from below. I could feel the tension on the rope, but it was a steady tension, not like someone was climbing up. Either way, I went out of there as fast as possible. I clipped on and scrambled up the rope. I hadn't noticed, but B had kept on moving toward the entrance. I got up the last feet in a hurry. I just unclipped and kept on moving, leaving the rope behind. By the time I got up to the cave entrance in the daylight, B was almost to where the rope was anchored. I wanted to get up so bad I almost started to free climb without clipping onto the rope. I could see B was almost up, so I cut on and started up. I almost didn't make it up. I just started up when I nearly collapsed from exhaustion. I managed to recover enough to pull myself up the last few feet. As I climbed, I could hear the tension on the rope manifest itself by the stretching noise on the rope. I prayed the cord would not break with me attached to it. The second that I reached the top, I unclipped the ascender. I could see B kneeling by the tree, so I limped over him and collapsed. For the first time since I went through Floyd's tomb, we could see each other. We just stared. I know it looked pretty bad, but didn't know that B was in such bad shape. He had cuts and scrapes on every exposed surface of his body. His face was pale, almost white. His mouth and eyes were wide open. He was breathing heavily, almost gasping. The shock we shared, the other person's appearance, was broken when we heard the rope around the tree stretch, and the knot had tied tight, and it was frozen in place. Overwhelmed with fright, Beast seemed to be transfixed on the knot. Then in one motion he produced a pocket knife and began to work on the rope. It's incredible how a person's state of mind can alter the perception of time. I'm sure it only took 4 or 5 seconds to sever the rope from the tree, but it seemed like an hour. Cord cut and knot hung to the ground while the end of the rope zipped across the rocks and the edge of the cliff. The speed of it causing a humming noise as it went. As soon as the cord was cut, Bee let out a cry. He dropped the knife and fell backward. Watching the rope fly over the edge brought feelings in the passage back to me. I got up and headed toward the trunk and noticed Bee was still laying there wide-eyed, staring at the point the rope disappeared. I called him, which seemed to break his trance. He got up and hurried away from the tree. The cave, the nightmare, neither of us said a word all the way home. Whew, we're almost to the end of this. Hang in there if you're still awake. If not, I don't blame you for falling asleep. This is kind of soothing in a way, but unsettling for some. It is now 4 days after a trip in the cave. It has taken 4 days and dozens of attempts to get the entire experience written in my journal. Every time I started to write, I recalled terrible feelings I had and couldn't write anymore. I felt compelled to document the unbelievable events while our details were fresh in my mind. I could still feel the pain, still smell the stench, still experience the terror. Even typing from my journal has taken hours. I'd like to write more, but it will have to wait. Even now, with several days between me and the event, I can't relax. I can barely concentrate. That's all for now. May 19th, 2001. It's been 3 weeks since our last visit to the cave. I wanted to update everyone on my condition and my plans for the caverns and the past few weeks' events. I apologize for not returning your phone calls. I've been getting all your messages. I just haven't filled up to calling back, Steve and Mark. Thanks for your words of encouragement on my answering machine. I know you two are sincerely concerned for me. You're fantastic friends, Mark. I know you stopped by the house a few times. I'm sorry I never answered the door. It really helped me knowing you just dropped by. Since I can hear the worry in your voice, I'm fine. Don't worry about me. Just take care of those nieces and nephews of mine. If I can get the site updated, I can let everyone know how I'm doing. A lot has happened in the last 3 weeks, so I'll try my best to cover everything. I guess I should start where my previous entry left off. It took several days to get the last journal entry written down. I was so shaken up from my experience I could do little else but sit and ponder what had happened. Right now I'm on my long-term medical leave from work. I tried to get back to work several days after the event, but my boss sent me home. I couldn't concentrate and I looked terrible. I've been to the doctor, but I couldn't tell him about the experience, so I just told him I was under a lot of stress. He recommended rest and gave me a prescription to help me relax. Good drugs. When we left the cave, I was nearly in a state of shock. I could not think clearly and was having a difficult time trying to understand what had happened. I didn't eat much, nor did I get any sleep. I was glad I had the presence of mind to write down my experience while it was fresh in my mind. As I reread what I wrote, I accurately portrayed what happened in the cave that day. I wouldn't change anything I wrote, even though it took 3 days to write it. I felt much better when I finished writing in my journal. I guess it's kind of therapeutic. Unfortunately, it didn't last. In fact, it was after then that things got terrible. Bee and I parted company after the trip, and I didn't see him again until yesterday. I didn't try to reach him, and he didn't try to get a hold of me, nor did either of us try to contact Joe. He just dropped me off after the trip, and I spent the next several days by myself in my house. I tried to eat, but had no appetite. I was restless, but I couldn't find anything to do to take my mind off the experience. That's when I determined I should write it down. As I mentioned, that helped me to think a little clearer. And I seemed to be a little calmer, but it didn't last. I went to work the next day, but was sent home. The day after that, I had an overwhelming feeling of anxiety sink into my soul. I was depressed and confused. No one had wanted to turn to for comfort. I got all kinds of phone calls from people, but I just let the answering machine take the calls. I even changed the message on the device to let everyone know I was alright. I continued this miserable state, eating and sleeping whenever I could. Managed until a week after the trip, then things started to get strange. First I heard sounds in the house that had no explanation. Footsteps, shuffling noises, creaking doors. Typical horror movie fare. While the sounds were not distinct, it was as though I wasn't sure I heard what I thought I heard. I'd be eating or getting out of the shower and stop thinking I heard something, but the sound would not repeat itself. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that it happened frequently, I couldn't be sure there were noises in the first place. Either I was scared, it was as though I'd been caught in a spiderweb for the last week. Feelings of anxiety, foreboding, tension filled my life. Then came the hallucinations. I began seeing things like the sounds I was hearing, just a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. When I would turn back to look, nothing. I slept with the lights on, but now I kept the house lights on from before dusk to after dawn. When I started to see things regularly, I purchased a gun. Got it from the ad in the paper, so I didn't have to wait for a permit. I went to the doctor, but didn't mention the details of my life. I just told him I couldn't relax. Walked out there with a prescription. Fortunately, my wounds and injuries were pretty much healed by this time. My back still hurt a little, but the medicine took care of that too. When I was on the medication, I felt great. I didn't want to walk around high the rest of my life, so I would only take it at the end of a tough day. Unfortunately, the severity of the sightings increased, giving rise to the need for the medication. Flashes in the corner of my eye continued, but then I began to see shapes and shadows. They would be outside my windows, usually at night, but I still couldn't make out anything solid, so it was hard to pin down what it was I was seeing. Soon I began to close all my drapes and blinds to remove the possibility of seeing something. Doing so did help in a respect, but my life was still a mess. My daily routine was mechanical and empty. I would sleep in as long as I could, usually out of exhaustion. Then I would get cleaned up and try to eat something. I lost a lot of weight, so I tried to get as much as possible down me. Then I would exercise a little, nap a lot. I'd only been out of the house a few times the last 2 weeks. The store, the doctor, the gun purchase. I didn't watch much TV because I couldn't concentrate. I spent a lot of time on the internet. I was doing research on caves and cave myths. The only story I could find was the caver folklore about Hodag. The Hodag is supposedly a creature that roams caves. 2 weeks after we went into the cave, I began having nightmares. A week after I started hearing things. Extremely lucid nightmares, no specific theme or recurring events. Just plain terrifying. Sometimes it was in my house, and someone was trying to get me. Only I couldn't run because I had no legs. Other times I was in a vat. Someone was pouring a syrup-like liquid on me, filling the vat. I would wake up in a panic. I would stay awake until the exhaustion forced me to enter dreamland once again. The brutal routine continued for several days until it reached a climax on the 6th day, yesterday. My dreams seemed so natural I had a hard time telling if I was awake or not. I was beaten, really drained of energy and spirit. I went from the living room to my bedroom in the early evening. When I looked down in the hall and saw a dark figure toward the end, I thought that it was a thief and began to back up slowly. It didn't move. As I was backing up, the light flickered on, off and on. Every muscle was tense. I stopped to stare at the figure. Just then the phone rang. It startled me so bad I stumbled over the chair. When I got up, I wheeled around to look around the hall. Nothing was there. I grabbed my keys and left the house. I felt compelled to get in the car and drive. My pulse pounded in my temples and I started the car. I wanted to move to Overlook Point to see the city lights. I didn't know why I needed to go there. I just knew I had to go. The closer I got, the more urgent the feeling. When I arrived at the point, I saw something that at first startled me but caused me to be more relaxed than I had been in a long time. Joe was there. He was out of his car, standing looking at the lights. We looked at each other. From the tired look on his face, I could see he'd been going through the same miserable trial I'd been experiencing. You could tell from the look in my face we shared some terrible experiences. Our conversation was unbelievably brief. "You've been back?" he began, even though he knew the answer. "Yes, we need to return." "Tomorrow good?" I asked. "Yeah, noon." He got in his car and I got into mine. I didn't even want to talk to him about his experience. Obviously, he didn't want to know mine. I drove over to B's house. When he answered the door, I thought B actually looked like he was doing fine, somewhat happy. One look at me and his disposition changed. Our conversation was also succinct. I ran to Joe and we're going back in tomorrow at noon. He looked dead serious. He just nodded his head and I asked him if I spend the night at his house. He eagerly let me in. I didn't notice until later, but every light in the house was turned on. He led me to a spare room. "Help yourself." "Thanks." I washed up in the bathroom and took some medication. Got the first decent sleep in a long time. I woke early in the morning and came home to get ready for the trip. I thought I would send out this update so no one will wonder what's going on with me. By the time most of you read this, I suspect that I will be back home and have a great story to tell. I promise that if you haven't heard from me by now, you will shortly. It is currently 10 a.m. on Saturday the 19th. We will be leaving for the cave in 2 hours. Preparing for this trip will be like no other trip I've been on. For the first time in my life, I will carry a gun into a cave. I'll also bring a knife and an extension first aid kit, plenty of food and water, and a camera. I'll take several sources of light and a pad of paper and pencil. I'll have all of my climbing rope since B lost his in the cave. I'll carry a reasonable length of string with me on the other side of Floyd's tomb. This is the first time in 3 weeks we've heard any reference to Floyd's tomb. It sent shivers down my spine just typing it. There's so many things I hope to accomplish this day. So many answers I hope to find in this tiny passage hidden from view. Reflecting on events leading up to today leaves me feeling dizzy. Was it all a bad dream? Unfortunately, I'm wide awake, and still in a few short hours I might face my nightmare. The thought of having another person with me in the passage does nothing to alleviate the fear I feel. I almost chuckle as I ponder a childish notion we will have to consider. Who will enter the tomb first? Who will lead the way into the dark unknown? Who will decide when to turn back? Foremost among the questions in my mind is, what about the video camera I left behind? It is supposed to be able to record in complete darkness. I left the thing running, so what will we find on the tape? Darker questions follow. What if the camera's gone? What if it's destroyed? Although it's difficult to put to an exact name on my motivation, I think closure fits quite nicely. I'll need to find out a few things about this cave. The main thing, believe it or not, is to find the end of the cave. With all the bizarre things I've witnessed these past few weeks, it would seem a bit trite to want as a primary goal to get to the end, but that is what I want. To be sure, I will be seeking other bits of knowledge along the way. If, however, I find the end of the central passage to be an end to the path, hidden by the rock, I will be content to never return to the cave's course again. Never. It would seem to me that crawling headfirst through the tight passage into the darkness is an unnatural thing, just like crawling up the side of a cliff for recreation, or jumping out of the perfect airplane and floating to the ground. We do these things to satisfy our hunger for adventure, the subconscious desire to conquer our own little Everest, as B is fond of saying. Caving is the last opportunity for exploration for the person with the modest means. True, just a short drive from just about anywhere in the country is a cave waiting to be explored. Even a cave well known among the general public can be approached by someone for the first time as an adventure. Something new, something to overcome, because it's there. Many of you don't agree with my decision to pursue this cave. I know this from the messages I received. I'm afraid I don't have a choice. If I'm ever to experience restful slumber, I must return. If I'm ever to walk the halls of my home in peace, I must return. If I'm ever to exit the overworld and enter the subterranean world of a cave, I must return. I no longer feel that I have a choice. I must return. For my family and friends who are reading this, I say, be at peace. I will conquer this cave. Then I will return and update this website immediately. I'll include any photos we take in the cave today. And if you stop by the house, I will show you the video I will have. Expect to be home later tonight or tomorrow at the latest. See all of you soon with a lot of answers. Love, Ted. Credit from Ted Hedgeman. And that was Ted the Caver. Final thoughts? Really long, really well drawn out, and honestly, I hardly kept track of the time while I was reading all of this. I mean, it was very good the way they used the sensory aspects of what the cave was like, and, made sure to note that, oh yeah, most of my audience probably has never been caving, so I should probably put this information here in a way they can understand. And so in terms of clarity, it was really good, despite the fact that I had to use Grammarly for a lot of things. And for what it's worth, I could almost kind of feel the terror that he did as I was reading this, if you can believe it. I mean, I'm kind of a method actor, so it's hard for me to kind of act, scared if I'm not at least somewhat unsettled by something. So, in that sense, it achieved its goal of, instilling that unsettledness. In fact, as of now, it's 3:10 a.m. where I'm at, and just the idea that I'm going to unlock my garage door and see something waiting outside, be it an animal, be it something that's been listening to me reading this and just been waiting to scare me. Yeah, that's the side effect of reading these creepypastas late at night. But on the plus side, it does get the best, most realistic presentation out of me that it can be. So, that benefit outweighs any anxiety I may have walking back into my house and quickly locking the door and all that jazz. And next week, no spoilers, but I plan to have it on location at a different place because, let's be honest, you guys are probably tired of seeing my garage by this point, and it might be kind of nice to do it at someone else's house like I did with the Writer Wednesday videos the last few times. So, the plan is I'll go to the Prancing Skill Terror House for the next reading, and I'm thinking, yeah, Disney's theme seems appropriate since, you know, A, it's safe for work, so I don't have to worry about any minors that may be listening in on it, you know, while I'm recording, you know, hearing something that, you know, then gets me kicked out of the place, you know. I know, funny with furries, but still, I want to exercise a level of respect when it's someone else's house. So, it seems to me that in the interest of that, there's quite a few interesting Disney creepypastas out there that are good. I mean, they may have a few flaws here and there with respect to, okay, well, yeah, that couldn't possibly happen, but suspend your disbelief long enough and you might actually enjoy some of them. Like, one of my personal favorites is the Disney Mirror Ritual, which absolutely I have to read when I'm there. But if I can, I'll try to get a guest star with me and we'll go back and forth with it as we see fit. And so I'll have links to her information as well, and yada yada yada. That being said, this has been Monster Mondays. All pertinent information you can find in the description below. And remember, Mom's not here, kids. Bye-bye.